In part two, now we're connecting the business strategy that we discussed in the first part of the lecture material with how that's related to staffing strategies. Specifically, we're looking at how, from top to bottom, staffing strategy has to support overall HR strategy. So, staffing strategy is considered a functional strategy, and it should be overall related to the human resource strategy, which should also be connected to the overall corporate strategy or business unit strategy, depending on how your company is structured. Let's keep it simple. We'll just think about it in the terms of a simple company that doesn't have multiple business units. It has one business unit. So I develop a staffing strategy that has to be connected to and related to other HR functions. So my staffing strategy can't be separated from my training and development strategy and my compensation strategy. It all has to be tied together, and performance management in general. Once I develop my strategy, it then goes back to supporting the human resource strategy, which has a firm direction that it wants to go into with respect to whatever the corporate strategy is. So if my company is in growth mode and it's a differentiation strategy company, I'm going to be hiring high quality workers who have tremendous talent and will charge top dollar for salaries and things like that. So that's how those things sort of come together. So these next two slides address the different strategies that we've already talked about in the first part. For example, are we going to be competing on cost, or are we competing on innovation? Are we competing more on the niche strategy, or are we thinking more just generalized growth, whatever that takes? So this slide, these next two slides, show us the advantage on the left-hand column. The middle column sort of describes the strategy, the corporate strategy that you want to engage in, and the far right-hand column addresses the staffing implications. For example, if you're competing on low cost, that means you're focused on efficient delivery of products and services with little waste. So your focus when it comes to staffing is you want people who are adaptable, trainable, willing to work in standardized processes, and is efficiency focused. Not somebody who's going to waste money and time and resources, but who is going to be very, very conscientious about the kinds of work that they do and how they manage their money. Alternatively, you've got innovation strategy, which is looking at streams of cutting-edge ideas, fast commercialization of new ideas. And so what we want there is we want to look for top research talent. We want people with creativity and tolerance for ambiguity, people who are self-motivated with an entrepreneurial mindset. And these are the staffing implications. And so it's really important when you begin working in a company to know how they compete, what they compete based on, whether it's cost or innovation, growth or niche strategy. Make sure you're clear what it is that they do and how they do it, and then the staffing implications naturally flow from that. And just to follow up from the previous slide, the idea of customization or niche strategy or growth strategy, again, it describes what it's like, and then the staffing implications on the far right-hand side. If you're in a growth mode, you want employees who are future oriented, who are flexible, who are willing to take calculated risks, and that they fit really well with the company culture, because these are the people who are going to lead the innovation and ultimately lead the organization over time. A niche strategy is also focused on adaptability and learning and networking. And so these sorts of skill sets are really important. And so our staffing strategy is going to be focused on finding people with these skill sets to make that work. Where a company is in its life cycle also influences its strategy choice. Organizations that are in growth mode or maturity mode are very different than those in the decline phase. So under growth mode, what you're looking for is internal talent who are incredibly adaptable and willing to pursue innovation and differentiation strategies. And this is when you're a new business, all you want to do is say how we're different, how we're better, what we're going to do that's exciting and new. So it is incredibly different than what other people are doing. The employees may be more risky because, again, you're not an established company, and so people are a little reticent to come and work for you. But if you're willing to invest time and money into people, people will develop loyalty and they'll stay and grow with you over time. So, where you are in the growth phase of your organization really influences the kind of staffing needs that you'll have. And so, it's quite likely you will be very much engaged in more of a niche or differentiation strategy in the early phases of your growth, which of course then reinforces the need for a high talented pool who may be, you may have to take some risks because, again, they're not dependable in that context. As companies transition from the early growth phase of their life cycle to the more mature phase, they are obviously up against greater competition. They're fighting for market share. And so, just like we would consider in the BCG matrix, where you have your cash cows, right? Your organization, by definition, becomes your cash cow. Your goal is to capitalize on the areas where you can maximize profitability and also minimize your expenses. So you can have profitability grow if you work more efficiently and you cut back your costs. So you might shift a little bit towards tighter profit margins because you're going to probably lower your prices to keep and maintain your market share. And so your focus is going to be much more on internal talent and keeping your internal talent, because if you have a lot of turnover, you're not going to be able to be cost efficient, right? Because there's a cost to turnover. So you want to maintain a stable pool of talent who also can grow with you when opportunities arise and make themselves aware. The last category in the lifestyle focus is looking at the decline phase towards the ends of organizations' life cycle. The goal would be cost leadership is incredibly important. You're going to have to lower your costs in order to survive or figure out a way to innovate and revive your product or your services. So there may be some sort of mixture of differentiation strategy or innovation in some areas and more cost effectiveness in other areas. You're going to need to have a good mix. So when a company's in its decline, you do need new blood. You do need new ideas. You do need people who are willing to take some risks to help lift the company out of this decline. And so the company may need to completely reinnovate itself and reimagine itself. Xerox used to be known for their copiers, and now they're known for many other different types of products and service offerings. When you're developing your talent philosophy, sort of the guiding principle by which you're going to manage your human resource talent, there's 4 basic questions to address. This comes from table 2.4 in your textbook. Number 1, do we want people to contribute to the company over the long haul, or are we just, filling vacancies in a stopgap manner in the short term? And how the approach we take, whether we're long-term focused or short-term focused, doesn't matter, right? I mean, we just have to follow a strategy consistently. Like McDonald's doesn't have a long-term strategy for its employees, except for their leadership and ownership. But, again, the fry cook at McDonald's doesn't stay the fry cook at McDonald's for their career. They learn skills, they move on, they go on to the next job, or they go off to college and get a different job as they graduate college, those sorts of things. And I like using that fry cook at McDonald's example because that's what I did in college. I basically worked hard to put myself through college, and I worked a lot of times at McDonald's to make money, extra money where appropriate. The second question we ask ourselves is, do we value the ideas and contributions of people with diverse ideas and perspectives? Taking a diversity strategy has to be a conscious choice. It's not just going to happen by accident. You have to specifically do this and specifically work on this. So that's a conscious decision that we need to make. The third question is, do we see our employees as assets to be managed, or employees as investors who choose where to allocate their time and effort? If you think of people just as expenses or something to be managed, that's a very different approach to employees than you see them as partners or as innovators and as people that can help us get ahead and be better. And again, think about where we see the human resource professional. Is the human resource professional in the top management team, and do they have a strategic seat at the table in the C-suite, or are they buried underneath the director of finance or the director of operations? If they're buried under other functional areas, then you're not going to invest a lot of time and money into your employees as assets. You're going to be thinking about them really as expenses to be managed only. So depending on your strategy, those are things to consider. The last thing to consider is, what are our ethical principles when it comes to our employees? And again, we have to think about what is the frame of reference, the frame of ethics that we want to use in terms of the policies and practices that we set up. And the next few slides sort of address where we can find good resources to help us come up with really good ethical principles for managing our employees. In terms of sources for ethical guidelines, this first page just covers the American Psychological Association and the role that they play in all sorts of ethical guides around human resource practices. For example, they are really clear about test takers' rights. And so when we're using certain assessment tools to determine who's going to be the right employee to hire, there are certain ethical guidelines about how we're supposed to handle those sorts of things. And that's in the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing in 1999. They talk about emerging staffing issues and making sure that we are having good quality instruments, making sure that it's done ethically, that, as the internet testing, it has a big part of this. How do we make sure that we maintain integrity and things like that? There are also ethical guidelines set up by SIOP, the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. They are the psychology peers in HR. They have stronger psychology background, whereas HR managers who have an MBA or a bachelor's degree have a more business focus. So either way, both talents are needed. Both talents are important. Understanding the business side of things is essential. And lastly, the principles for the validation and use of personnel selection procedures. That was an ethical guideline in 2003 set up by the APA. So make sure you take advantage of all those resources so you know what's available to you. The last three sources we have for ethical guidelines come from a number of different resources. Number one is the Uniform Guidelines and Employee Selection Procedures. This came out of 1978, and the guidelines so that we could be clear how we're supposed to conduct validity studies, make sure we test for adverse impact, making sure that selection tools used are appropriate and are not having an unintended impact on others. Then we've got the Society for Human Resource Management, SHRM. These are all the practitioners that engage in SHRM or are members of SHRM. We have really clear guidelines and codes of ethics for those who are members of SHRM about the behaviors they're supposed to engage in as HR professionals. And lastly, an organization you may not be aware of is called the Academy of Management. The Academy of Management is responsible for doing tremendous amounts of research on the field of management, and then specifically two divisions that are really important to me. I'm a member, an active member of the Academy of Management, and a moderate member of the Society for Human Resource Management. I have my advanced certification in HR, but my Academy of Management membership is really important, and that addresses research, specifically how we do research on diversity issues. I belong to the Gender and Diversity in Organizations division. It's a really important organization or important division that addresses all sorts of research on diversity-related issues in the workplace. And then lastly, the Human Resource Management Division, which is also, again, an important one for our purposes because they look at HR practices and HR policies and HR staffing issues and strategy issues, and they do research on them. And the information from those, from the research that we academics do should be filtered down to, business practice. And so that's our goal is for the Academy of Management is to see that the work that we do influence actual management practice down the line. So HR strategy and staffing strategy, as we've already discussed, are tightly linked. The HR strategy is the overall strategy that addresses all functional areas of HR. For example, a personnel management or performance management strategy, a compensation strategy, a employee relations strategy, or a labor relations strategy. Staffing strategy falls in here as a subcategory of the human resource strategy. The goal of HR strategy has to be linked to other functional areas in the business. For example, it should be linked to accounting and finance and marketing and operations, etc. All those work to support the overall corporate strategy. And then staffing strategy is the specialized area that addresses specifically the kinds of things we need to do to manage the flow of talent in and out of the company. So talent philosophy influences HR strategy and staffing strategy. So we start with the talent philosophy. Do we want our employees to contribute over the long haul of their careers? So if that's something that we value, then our HR strategy has to be about acquiring, developing, and retaining talent so that they stay with the company over time. So from there, we can think about what the staffing strategy needs to be. How do we hire them? How do we deploy them? And how do we retain them? From a hiring perspective, we recruit and hire talent that performs now and in the future. So we want to keep them up to date on their skill set. Deploying means that we use really good succession planning so people have a really concrete way to grow and advance with the company, and that makes them want to stay over the long haul. And then we need to have a good retention policy in terms of treating employees well, but also paying them well and rewarding them for good work. And those are all the strategies that we need to support the overall philosophy of wanting employees to contribute to the long-term needs of the firm. And we could say the same thing about a philosophy that's about diversity. Ultimately, in the end, we want to recruit and hire diverse people. We want to have mentoring programs to help with their advancement, and we want to reward and promote people who are actively engaged in diversity on campus. And not on campus, but also on the organization's property and within their boundaries. But also on campus if you're working at a university like we do. This next page just continues our discussion about the influence of talent philosophy on HR strategy and staffing strategy. And the last two philosophies are thinking about as employees as investors of their time and effort. That means you've got to be thinking about the different kinds of hiring, deploying, and retention strategies. And if you're looking for high ethical standards, again, hiring, deploying, and retaining has a different nuance where we want to focus with people who comply with the law, engage in good ethical behaviors, give honest, performance feedback, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't need to go into too much detail on that. I think you guys can review that on your own. It's table 2.5 in the textbook. This next slide is from table 2.6, and it talks about the 9 elements of staffing strategy. Now, I've seen other textbooks address it as 14 or 15 elements, but basically this gets down to the most important stuff. So I'll go along with this particular list. Number 1, do we want a core or flexible workforce? A flexible workforce has a small core, but has a lot of people that come and go. Like, for example, if you're Macy's and you hire a lot of temporary staff during the holiday season, that's a flexible workforce. Or do you want to have a solid core of workers who you can always depend on with very little flexibility on the peripheries, right? Do you want to hire internally or externally, which means do you take a promotional strategy where you promote people from within first, or you want to have a mixed external strategy where you bring people from the outside, or some mixture of the two? I certainly recommend a mixture of the two. You don't want to be all external or all internal because both of those extremes can create serious problems for companies. But of course, anything at the extremes is problematic. What you're really looking for is to what extent do you err more towards internally or more towards the external focus? And again, internal focus rewards for promotion and keeps people there over the long haul. External focuses on innovation and bringing in new, fresh ideas. So there's a mix there that's going to work well for your company. The next one is, do we want to hire for or train and develop needed skills? Now, again, it also has to do with whether or not you're hiring people for the company culture or you're hiring them for their skills. If you're hiring people for the company culture, you're really hiring them with the right attitude. So you want to have them connected to the company in some way, and then you can always train them, but that person organization match is really important to you, making sure that the person and the organization are comfortably connected to each other. If you're doing a person job match, you're simply hiring them, and training them to have the skills that you need. The other thing to consider around this is, do you want people to come in with the skills right away? Or are you comfortable with saying, as long as they have good competencies, I will train them in whatever area I need to train them on? If this is something that people are unique and need to have coming in advance because you don't have the capability to train them, that's a separate issue too. So you're either hiring people with the talent that they need or the skill set that you need, or you're going to train them on it later. And this may have to do with whether your focus is person-organization match or person job match, or whether or not you have the internal capabilities of doing the training or not. If you don't have the internal capabilities, then you hire people with the talent that you need. And that, again, goes into motivation theories and things, making sure that people have the skills they need to do their job. Number 4, do we want to replace or retain our talent? McDonald's has a replacement strategy because they know that workers are more like a commodity where they don't need a high-skilled workforce, and so people can kind of come and go. If they lose someone, they'll hire somebody else. They'll train them, very specifically what they need, but they are more comfortable with, they expect a higher level of turnover, right? Other companies invest an enormous amount of money in their workers in terms of training and development, and so the last thing they want to do is replace them. So they're going to work on retention, and so most of their attention is on retaining talent, and so they invest more on the retention side so that when they get somebody, they can retain them and they never leave. I mean, there's incredibly low turnover at companies like Google and Southwest Airlines because nobody wants to leave. They're really great companies, and the company takes a retention strategy in terms of their focus. Next is the level of which skills do we need where. So again, certain positions need people to have skills when they walk in the door. And Southwest Airlines, for example, recognizes this. So they are less concerned about skill levels in a lot of the office workers because they'll train anybody with the particular skills as long as they have the right attitude. But there are still certain jobs that require a certain level of skill. For example, pilots need a certain level of skill. Mechanics need also a certain level of skill. And those are not things you can just say, hey, come on board and I'll train you on the job, right? I mean, you need to have hours of flight experience and you need to have hours of training in the mechanical side of things. And we certainly wouldn't want an airline running on anything less than the highest quality, offerings in that area. So if certain levels of skill are needed based on certain job types. And so we may have a strategy that includes a mix of, some positions need to have high skill set and some don't. Number 6, will we staff proactively or reactively? So if we are reactive, again, we can acknowledge that we're going to be reactive, and all we're going to do basically is when we see a vacancy, we fill it, and that's it. A proactive strategy is where we're actively looking downstream a few years from now, and we know a year from now, or we know 6 months from now, we're going to need more employees in a particular area, so we're going to focus on developing and staffing and getting ready to proactively go after employees based on, forecasting, planning, and things like that. Number 7, which jobs should we focus on? Again, it depends. It depends on where we need to have our talent investment. Again, McDonald's spends an enormous amount of time developing their managers, assistant managers, and managers and owners. They spend time training, but they don't spend a tremendous amount of time training their entry-level workers who are working at the fry machine. So certain types of jobs need different attention than others. Certain types of jobs take longer to fill than others. So knowing what jobs we're focusing on is going to be important. Do we think of staffing as an investment or a cost? And again, this goes back to how the company considers and thinks about HR strategy, HR in general. If HR is under the COO or the CFO, then they think of them as a cost center, and that's about it. But if your HR and your people management function is in the C-suite and the top management team, then employees will be thought of more as an investment. Lastly, is staffing centralized or decentralized? Again, a large multinational or global conglomerate is going to have decentralized staffing because it's going to be incredibly difficult for one HR team to do all of the staffing strategy. And we may have some general ideas that we want each of our divisions and departments to focus on, certain skill sets, certain personality competencies and things like that. But generally speaking, are we going to have a one-size-fits-all approach, more centralized approach to things, or are we going to allow for more decentralization? And I think the larger and more global the company, the more we really need to focus on some degree of homogeneity in terms of some basic values. But beyond that, your function itself is going to be very decentralized because you have to adapt to the market in which you are hiring. You need to know what the talents are of the locals and what to be expected in those arenas. This last slide in the business and staffing strategy lecture is dealing with the difference between human capital advantage and human process advantage. Human process advantages, as it says there, is just focusing on work processes that create competitive advantage. And so we can have we can plug individuals into a process that we think is going to help us to create the competitive advantage. Human capital advantages is about looking at the quality of the people who are going to do the work, who are going to engage in those processes. And this is about making sure we hire and retain outstanding people to have a good stock of talented individuals who can do the work of the company. And then they can engage in those work processes. So, talent advantage is much more focused on the actual skill set of the human resources in the company. And then the work process is a separate aspect of that. It's important, and we need to have superior work processes that don't waste time and are efficient and effective. But the human capital advantage is going to help us in all those areas. If we've got good, strong people, we can compete in any market and have really good processes because we've got talented people to develop those processes. So that's it on business and staffing strategy, and the next up is the legal context.